It was a sunny afternoon in a bustling downtown neighborhood. People were going about their day, kids playing on the sidewalk, street vendors calling out their deals, and a group of teens laughing over their phones near a corner store. In this vibrant slice of city life, nobody could have predicted how quickly an ordinary day would spiral into chaos. And at the center of it all was a moment that would change everything for one young girl and the cop who made a decision he'd soon regret. She was just 15, standing with her friends after school, her laughter lighting up the street like music. Amani was her name, a bright, kind-hearted girl who was well loved in her community. Her curly hair bounced as she animatedly told a story, completely unaware that the next few moments would mark her forever. Nearby, a police officer named Officer Daniels was on patrol. To him, it was just another routine day, another block to pass through. But today, his actions would become the focus of a firestorm he wasn't prepared for. The tension began when a commotion broke out across the street. A heated argument between two men escalated near the store entrance, drawing a small crowd. Officer Daniels, seeing the gathering of people, approached, ready to intervene. He had handled countless disturbances like this before, and in his mind, this was no different. But the situation wasn't as clear-cut as he thought. As he got closer, Amani and her friends moved instinctively toward the edge of the crowd, curious but keeping their distance. That's when it happened. In the chaos of raised voices, sudden shoving, and the officer trying to break up the fight, a canister of pepper spray appeared in Daniel's hand. Without hesitation, he aimed, intending to scatter the crowd and defuse the situation. But as the spray dispersed, the unintended happened. Amani, standing off to the side, caught the full brunt of it. The effect was immediate. She stumbled back, gasping for air, her hands flying to her face as her friends screamed for help. The burning sensation overtook her, tears streaming uncontrollably as she cried out in pain. Around her, people yelled at the officer, some filming the scene on their phones. She wasn't doing anything, someone shouted. The tension in the air shifted from confusion to anger in seconds. Daniels froze for a moment, his grip tightening on the spray. His mind raced, realizing the gravity of what had just happened. He hadn't noticed her there, hadn't meant for this to happen, but it was too late. The damage was done. As the crowd pressed in, demanding answers and hurling accusations, one of Amani's friends managed to dial her father. "You need to come quick," the friend said, her voice shaking with panic. Something happened to Amani. What Officer Daniels didn't know, what nobody in that crowd knew, was who Amani's father really was. And when he arrived, the story would take a turn no one could have seen coming. The air was thick with tension as Amani's friends hovered around her, trying to comfort her as best they could. Her cries of pain were heart-wrenching, and her once bright eyes were now shut tightly, tears mixing with the stinging spray. The crowd around them grew louder, their anger bubbling over into shouts aimed directly at Officer Daniels. He tried to speak, raising his hands in what he hoped was a calming gesture, but it only seemed to fuel the frustration. "She's just a kid," someone yelled, their voice shaking with emotion. "You didn't even think before you acted." Daniels felt his stomach churn. He had been on the force for 10 years and had seen his fair share of tense situations, but this one felt different. This wasn't a hardened criminal or someone resisting arrest. This was a young girl, someone's daughter, who had been caught in the crossfire of a moment he couldn't take back. And now, the weight of that mistake was pressing down on him like a ton of bricks. Meanwhile, Amani's friend kept the phone pressed to her ear, her voice frantic as she tried to explain what had happened. "Please hurry," she said, tears streaming down her face as she glanced at Amani, who was now trembling and clutching her chest. "She's really hurt." Amani's father, Michael, didn't need much convincing. The moment he heard his daughter's name and the urgency in her friend's voice, he was out the door. Michael was not the kind of man to stand idly by when his family was in trouble. Those who knew him understood that he was fiercely protective of his loved ones. And when it came to Amani, his youngest, he was even more so. But there was more to Michael than most people realized. In his younger years, he had been a prominent figure in the community, not just for his work as a successful business owner, but also for his connections. His calm demeanor masked a complex history, one filled with relationships and influence that stretched far beyond the neighborhood. Michael wasn't just a man. He was Asterisk, the Asterisk Man, someone who had built respect and alliances in places others couldn't reach. And while he had long since traded the fast-paced, high-stakes world of his past for a quieter life focused on his family, his name still carried weight in ways most people didn't understand. The drive to the scene felt like an eternity. As he navigated the streets, his mind raced with questions. What had happened? Was Amani safe? Who was responsible? But more than anything, Michael felt the slow boil of anger rising within him. He had worked hard to shield his children from harm, to give them a life where they didn't have to look over their shoulders or fear authority. And now, here he was, rushing to his daughter's side because someone had hurt her. Someone who was supposed to protect her. Back at the scene, the crowd continued to grow. People from nearby shops and apartments had gathered, their curiosity quickly turning to outrage as word spread about what had happened. Cell phones were out, recording every angle of the incident. Daniels could feel the eyes on him, the judgment and disbelief cutting through the air like knives. He tried to stay composed, but the shouting was relentless. Is this how you serve and protect? One man demanded, pointing an accusatory finger. Why didn't you check who you were aiming at? Another chimed in. Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when he saw the flashing lights of an approaching car. It wasn't a police cruiser, and for a brief moment, he felt a flicker of hope that backup had arrived to help defuse the situation. But when the car came to a screeching halt, and Michael stepped out, Daniels realized this wasn't backup. This was something else entirely. Michael's presence was commanding. Dressed sharply, his tall frame and steady stride gave him an air of authority that immediately silenced a crowd. He didn't need to yell or push his way through. People moved aside of their own, sensing the seriousness of the moment. His eyes scanned the scene, quickly landing on Amani, who was now sitting on the curb with her friends trying to clean her face with bottled water and tissues. Amani. Michael called out, his voice filled with a mix of worry and determination. He dropped to his knees beside her, gently taking her face in his hands. Baby, I'm here. I'm here. Amani sobbed harder at the sound of his voice, her words muffled and broken. It burns, Daddy. Michael's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady as he reassured her. It's going to be okay. I've got you. He turned to her friends, who were visibly shaken. Thank you for staying with her, he said softly. I'll take it from here. Then Michael stood and turned to face Daniels. The crowd watched in hushed anticipation, the energy shifting once again. Daniels, still holding the canister of pepper spray, felt an undeniable sense of dread as Michael walked toward him. He had no idea who this man was, but the look in his eyes told Daniels one thing. This wasn't going to end well. You the one who did this? Michael asked, his tone calm but icy. Daniels hesitated before nodding. It was an accident. I didn't mean. Michael held up a hand, cutting him off. Save it, he said, his voice low. You didn't mean to. That's supposed to make it okay. You think an apology's gonna undo what you just did to my little girl? Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He knew nothing he could say would make a difference. Michael stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. Let me tell you something, he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced even the murmurs of the crowd. You have no idea who you just messed with. You think you can spray a kid in the face and walk away like it's no big deal? You think there won't be consequences. The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger refocusing on Daniels. And while Daniels tried to maintain his composure, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was in way over his head. As Michael turned back toward Amani, one of the bystanders muttered, He's not just some guy you know. That's Michael Reed. You don't want to get on his bad side. Daniels heard the name but didn't recognize it. Still, the warning sent a chill down his spine. He had a sinking feeling that this wasn't going to blow over quietly. Whatever was coming next, he wasn't ready for it. And as Michael knelt beside his daughter once more, the crowd began to disperse, their whispers growing fainter, but no less significant. Everyone knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning, and as Daniel stood frozen in place, the weight of his actions settled on him like a storm cloud, dark and unrelenting. The ride to the hospital was silent except for Amani's soft whimpers as Michael held her hand. He sat stiffly in the back seat with her, his jaw clenched as his mind replayed the scene over and over. Every tear that fell down her swollen face was like a dagger to his heart. He hadn't wanted to leave the street without confronting that officer further, but getting Amani medical attention was more important. Still, his resolve was clear. This wasn't over. As they arrived at the emergency room, Michael carried Amani inside, her head resting against his shoulder. Nurses immediately ushered her to a treatment area, and Michael was left pacing in the waiting room. His phone buzzed non-stop, calls and texts from friends, neighbors, and even a few reporters who had somehow already caught wind of the incident. Word traveled fast in their community, and this wasn't the kind of story that stayed quiet. Michael's best friend, Jerome, arrived minutes later, his face a mix of concern and anger. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, gripping Michael's shoulder. "How's she doing?" "She's in there now," Michael said, his voice low but steady. "They're checking her eyes, her skin." "I don't know. She's in pain, Jerome. Real pain." Jerome shook his head, his hands balling into fists. "This is unacceptable, Mike. That cop, he needs to be held accountable." "Oh, he will be," Michael said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "You know me. I don't let things like this slide." Jerome sighed, glancing toward the double doors that led to the treatment rooms. "But you got to play this smart, man. They'll try to spin it, say it was an accident to make excuses. You know how they do." Michael's lips pressed into a thin line. "They can try all they want. This isn't just about what happened today. It's about what this represents. How many more of our kids have to go through this? How many more apologies do they think we'll accept?" Jerome nodded solemnly. "So what's the plan?" Michael didn't answer right away. His mind was already working through the steps, the connections he needed to call on, the strategies he used. He had spent years navigating systems that weren't built for people like him, and he wasn't about to let Amani become another statistic. Meanwhile, back at the scene, Officer Daniels sat in his patrol car, staring blankly at the dashboard. The crowd had mostly dispersed, but a few people lingered, watching him with expressions that ranged from disgust to quiet judgment. His partner, Officer Mills, had arrived shortly after Michael left, and was now leaning against the car, speaking in a hushed tone. "You screwed up, man," Mills said bluntly, shaking his head. "You should have been more careful." "I didn't mean for this to happen," Daniels muttered, his voice barely audible. "It was chaotic. I was trying to control the situation." "Yeah, well, good luck explaining that when internal affairs gets involved," Mills replied. "And the asterisk will asterisk get involved. You saw all those cameras, right? This is gonna blow up." Daniels let out a shaky breath, rubbing his temples. He wasn't a bad cop, at least he didn't think he was. He had joined the force to make a difference, to protect people, to be the kind of officer his community could trust. But now, all he could see were the tears streaming down that girl's face, the way her father had looked at him like he was the worst kind of villain. "Do you know who that guy was?" Mills asked, his tone lowering. "No," Daniels admitted. "Just some angry dad." Mills snorted. "That angry dad is Michael Reed. Used to run with some powerful circles back in the day. You don't want him as an enemy." Daniels frowned. "What kind of circles?" "The kind that make problems disappear," Mills said cryptically. "Look, I'm just saying you better hope he wants to handle this legally. If he decides to play it another way..." He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. Daniels didn't respond. He felt like he was sinking, the weight of his mistake pulled him under. And for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he could fix what he had broken. Hours later, Amani was finally discharged from the hospital with instructions to rest and follow up with a specialist. Her eyes were red and puffy, her face still blotchy from the irritation, but the doctors assured Michael that she would heal with time. As they pulled into the driveway of their home, neighbors gathered on the porch and sidewalk, waiting anxiously for updates. Michael carried Amani inside, thanking everyone for their concern, but declining to speak much. He needed a moment to breathe, to process everything. But as soon as Amani was settled in her room, he went straight to his study, where Jerome and a few other close friends were waiting. "This isn't just about what happened to my daughter," Michael began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "It's about how easily these things keep happening. It's about how they think they can act without consequences." Jerome nodded. "So what's the move?" Michael pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. "We bring attention to this. We make noise. They want to act like this isn't a big deal. We'll show them just how big it is." "Social media," one of the friends suggested. "Not just social media," Michael said. "We're going to the news. We're filing formal complaints. We're rolling the community. And we're going to make sure that officer, and every officer like him, knows that we're not going to stand for this anymore." Jerome raised an eyebrow. "And if they try to sweep it under the rug?" Michael's expression hardened. "Then we remind them who they're dealing with." Outside, as the neighborhood buzzed with talk of what had happened, a reporter from a local station approached the house, camera crew in tow. They had heard about the incident through social media, where videos of the confrontation were already gaining traction. The hashtag Justice for Amani was starting to trend, and people were demanding answers. The reporter knocked on the door, and after a moment, Michael opened it, his face calm but resolute. "Mr. Reed, can you comment on the incident involving your daughter and the police officer earlier today?" the reporter asked, microphone extended. Michael glanced back toward the hallway, where Amani was resting. Then he turned back to the reporter, his expression unreadable. "I'll comment," he said, stepping outside. "But understand this. This isn't just about my daughter. This is about every child, every family who has ever been hurt by the people who are supposed to protect us. And we're not stopping until we see real change." The reporter nodded, her camera rolling as Michael began to speak. And as his words carried out into the night, the world beyond their little neighborhood started to pay attention. But even as momentum built, Michael knew this was only the beginning. The real battle was yet to come. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind. The video of the incident had gone viral, drawing outrage from every corner of social media. People were reposting the clip with captions like "*This has to stop*" and "*Justice for Amani". News outlets picked up the story, replaying the footage on every major network, and the spotlight on the small community was brighter than ever. Protesters began gathering in front of the police precinct, their signs and chants echoing through the streets. Inside their home, Michael stayed glued to his phone, fielding calls from activists, lawyers, and even some public figures who wanted to offer their support. Amani, still recovering, watched the coverage from the couch. She wasn't used to this kind of attention and felt overwhelmed by the sudden flood of strangers talking about her pain, and what had happened. "Dad, do we have to keep doing this?" she asked softly one evening as Michael sat across from her. "I just want to forget about it." Michael leaned forward, his expression tender but firm. "I know this is hard, baby. I know you didn't ask for any of this. But it's not just about you anymore. What happened to you, it's happening to other kids too. We have to make sure it stops." Amani nodded slowly, though she didn't feel entirely convinced. She missed the days when her biggest worry was finishing her homework or deciding what music to listen to on her walk home. Now, it felt like her entire world had shifted, and she wasn't sure she liked the new reality. While the Reeds dealt with the growing media storm, Officer Daniels found himself under increasing scrutiny. The police department had placed him on administrative leave, a move they claimed was standard protocol. But for Daniels, it felt more like a punishment. He couldn't escape the public backlash. Everywhere he turned, there were angry emails, protesters outside the station, and even his neighbors giving him cold. At home, he sat in his dimly lit living room, flipping through the TV channels, every station filled with discussions about police accountability and the growing call for justice. His wife, Emily, sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "Why don't you just make a statement?" she suggested cautiously. Explain your side of the story. Daniels shook his head. It won't matter. No one wants to hear my side. All they see is the video, and to them, I'm already guilty. Emily frowned, unsure how to comfort him. What are you going to do? Daniels didn't answer. He was haunted by the memory of Amani's face, the way she had cried out in pain, and the look her father had given him. He knew he had made a mistake, but the weight of that mistake felt like it might crush him. Meanwhile, Michael was busy planning the next steps. The community had rallied around him, organizing a march to demand justice. The march was set for Saturday, and Michael knew it would be the turning point. He had spent hours on the phone, coordinating with local leaders, civil rights organizations, and even a few politicians who had expressed their support. Jerome, as always, was by his side. You ready for this? Jerome asked one evening as they reviewed their plans. I don't think you can ever be ready for something like this, Michael admitted, but I know it has to be done. Jerome nodded, his expression serious. Just be careful. The bigger this gets, the more they're going to try to push back. Michael gave him a knowing look. Let them push. We're not backing down. As Saturday approached, the tension in the air was palpable. The march had drawn attention from across the state, with people planning to travel in from neighboring cities to show their support. At the same time, there were whispers that counter-protesters might show up, and the police department had announced that additional officers would be deployed to maintain order. On the morning of the march, Amani sat at the kitchen table, watching her father prepare. He was calm but focused, his movements deliberate as he checked his notes and reviewed the route with Jerome. Amani hesitated before speaking. Are you scared? She asked quietly. Michael paused, looking at her with a small smile. A little, he admitted. But sometimes being scared means you're about to do something important. Amani nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. She wasn't sure if she believed in the importance of all this, but she trusted her father. If he said it was worth it, she wanted to believe him. By the time the march began, the streets were filled with people. Families, students, activists, and community leaders all marched side by side, their chants echoing through the air. Justice for Amani, they called, justice for all. Michael led the way, holding a megaphone and speaking with a conviction that inspired everyone around him. But as they neared the police precinct, the atmosphere shifted. A line of officers stood in front of the building, their expressions unreadable behind their helmets and shields. Counter-protesters had also gathered, their signs and shouts clashing with the message of the march. The tension was electric, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Michael kept his voice steady, addressing the crowd through the megaphone. We're here to demand accountability. We're here to demand change. And we're not leaving until we're heard. But even as he spoke, he could feel the unease in the air. The crowd was restless, the officers were on edge, and the counter-protesters were growing louder. He glanced at Jerome, who gave him a reassuring nod, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. And then, like a storm breaking, it did. A shout rang out from somewhere in the crowd, followed by a scuffle near the police line. Officers moved in, tensions flared, and chaos erupted. Michael tried to maintain control, calling for calm through the megaphone, but his voice was drowned out by the commotion. In the midst of it all, Michael's eyes locked onto someone standing on the edge of the fray. Officer Daniels. Daniels wasn't in uniform, but had come to the precinct, his face pale as he watched the scene unfold. For a moment, their eyes met, and Michael saw something he didn't expect. Regret. But before he could process it, the crowd surged, and the moment was lost. As the chaos escalated, Michael knew this was the tipping point. Whatever happened next would determine not just the outcome of the day, but the future of everything he had been fighting for. The chaos at the precinct grew louder, more unruly, as the chants clashed with the shouts of counter-protesters and the commands of the police. Michael stood in the center of it all, gripping the megaphone tightly, his voice straining to cut through the noise. Stay peaceful, he called out, his words directed at the protesters who looked to him for guidance. But the energy in the air had shifted, and controlling it felt like trying to hold back a storm. Nearby, Officer Daniels remained rooted to the spot, watching the scene with a growing sense of dread. He had come here hoping to understand the impact of what he'd done, maybe even find a way to make things right. But now, standing at the edge of this boiling conflict, he realized just how deep the divide was. His presence wasn't helping. If anything, it was making things worse. People had started to recognize him, their eyes narrowing with anger as whispers spread through the crowd. Michael noticed the shift almost immediately. People were pointing, their murmurs growing louder. And then someone yelled, "That's him. That's the cop." The crowd turned, faces filled with fury and frustration, their focus narrowing in on Daniels. The officer visibly flinched, his instincts screaming at him to leave, but his feet wouldn't move. Michael felt the pressure mount as he watched the crowd's attention shift toward Daniels. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't what he wanted. He dropped the megaphone and began moving toward the officer, his heart pounding in his chest. "Stop!" Michael shouted, his voice cutting through the din. "This isn't what we're here for." He raised his hands, trying to calm the growing wave of anger that was threatening to spill over. But the tension was too high, the emotions too raw. Daniels, sensing the danger, finally found the strength to step back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he called out, his voice trembling. I wanted to." But before he could finish, a bottle flew through the air, narrowly missing him and shattering against the pavement. The sound was like a trigger, and the crowd surged forward, their frustration boiling over. Michael pushed his way through, stepping in front of Daniels and holding his arms out wide. "Enough!" Michael shouted, his voice fierce. "This is not the way. This is not justice." The crowd hesitated, their momentum faltering as they saw Michael standing between them and the officer. His presence carried weight, a reminder of why they were there in the first place. Slowly, the anger began to ebb, though it didn't disappear entirely. Daniels looked at Michael, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. Michael turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Then you'd better make it right," he said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy with expectation. Daniels nodded, swallowing hard. But before either man could say more, the sound of sirens pierced the tension. Police reinforcements arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the dim evening. Officers poured out of vehicles, forming a line to separate the crowd from the precinct. The protesters froze, uncertainty rippling through them. The tension, which had momentarily lessened, climbed back to its peak. Michael stepped forward again, raising his hands to address the crowd. "Don't let them turn this into something it's not," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We came here for justice, not violence. Don't give them an excuse to ignore us." His words resonated, and the crowd began to calm, though the energy remained taut, like a wire stretched to its limit. Michael glanced back at Daniels, who was being ushered away by another officer. Their eyes met one last time before Daniels disappeared into the precinct. But just as the situation seemed to stabilize, a new development threw everything into disarray. A woman emerged from the crowd, her face partially hidden by a scarf. She carried a thick envelope, which she held up high, shouting, "I have proof. Proof of what they've been doing." The crowd turned their attention to her, the tension shifting again. Michael frowned, stepping toward her cautiously. "What are you talking about?" he asked. The woman lowered her voice, looking directly at him. "There's more to this than just your daughter. That cop, he's part of something bigger. They've been covering things up for years. This is the evidence." Michael hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. He took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside were photographs, documents, and records. Names, dates, incidents that painted a picture far worse than anything he had imagined. This wasn't just about her money. This was about a pattern, a system that had allowed this kind of behavior to flourish unchecked. As he flipped through the papers, his mind raced. This changed everything. The fight for justice wasn't just about holding one officer accountable anymore. It was about dismantling something much larger, much more insidious. But even as the enormity of the task loomed over him, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. He turned back to the crowd, holding up the envelope. "This isn't just about my daughter," he said, his voice strong. "This is about all of us. And we're not stopping until we uncover the truth." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy reignited. But even as Michael stood tall, the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on his shoulders. He knew the road would only get harder from here, and the risks would grow. But for money, for the community, and for the truth, he was willing to face whatever came next. As the crowd cheered, Michael held the envelope tightly, feeling the weight of the evidence and the responsibility it carried. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It never really was. It was about every family that had been hurt, every voice that had been silenced, and every moment of injustice that had been swept under the rug. The protesters, now galvanized by the promise of truth, began to chant louder, their voices carrying a new determination. But Michael knew he couldn't stop there. He needed to act quickly before the evidence disappeared into the wrong hands or got dismissed as just another baseless accusation. The documents were damning. Names of officers involved in misconduct, records of complaints that had been ignored, and even emails hinting at coordinated efforts to cover up incidents similar to what had happened to Imani. Jerome appeared at Michael's side, his expression a mix of awe and urgency. "What's the plan, man?" he asked, glancing at the envelope. "We go public," Michael said firmly. "The truth can't be buried if everyone sees it." Jerome nodded, his faith in Michael unwavering. Together, they moved to the front of the crowd, where several local reporters had gathered to cover the march. Michael didn't hesitate. He held up the envelope and addressed the cameras directly, his voice steady and clear. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident," he said. "This is about a system that protects its own at the cost of our community. This is about accountability, transparency, and justice. And this," he held up the papers for the cameras to see, "is the proof." The reporters surged forward, their microphones and cameras capturing every word. Michael handed copies of the documents to several trusted journalists, ensuring the information would be out in the world no matter what happened next. The crowd roared its approval, their chants growing louder as the reality of what they were fighting for became clearer. But just as it seemed like the tide was turning, a sudden commotion rippled through the crowd. Officers from the precinct began advancing, their orders sharp and their movements decisive. The tension, which had been simmering all evening, reached a breaking point. Michael turned to Jerome. "Stay with the money," he said urgently. "Make sure she's safe." Jerome nodded, pulling the money back as the officers moved closer. Michael, determined to keep the focus on the message and not the chaos, stepped forward again, raising his hands in a gesture of calm. "We're peaceful," he shouted. "We're not here to fight. We're here for the truth." But his words were drowned out by the sudden crackle of the megaphone. A senior officer, flanked by a line of police, began issuing commands for the crowd to disperse. The situation was spiraling out of control, and Michael could see that the officers weren't there to de-escalate. They were there to end this, no matter the cost. And then, out of the chaos, a familiar figure emerged. Officer Daniels stepped forward, his face pale but determined. He raised his hands, signaling for the other officers to hold back. The senior officer glared at him, clearly frustrated by the interruption, but Daniels didn't waver. "Wait," Daniels said, his voice carrying over the noise. "This is on me. Let me handle it." Michael watched as Daniels turned toward him, his expression conflicted but resolute. The two men locked eyes, and for a moment the chaos seemed to pause. "I can't change what I did," Daniels said, his voice low but steady. "But I can help make this right." Before Michael could respond, Daniels reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. He held it up for everyone to see, his hand trembling slightly. "This has everything," he said, his voice cracking. "Internal reports, memos, evidence of the cover-ups. They tried to hide it, but I made a copy." The crowd gasped, the weight of Daniel's confession sinking in. Michael stepped forward cautiously, his eyes never leaving the flash drive. "Why now?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why are you doing this?" Daniels looked down, his guilt written across his face. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because I saw her, your daughter, and I couldn't live with myself if I stay silent." Michael took the flash drive, his hands steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. He turned to the crowd, holding it up alongside the envelope. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with a renewed sense of hope. "This is the truth." The crowd erupted in cheers once more, their voices carrying the promise of change. But even as the energy surged, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over yet. The documents and the flash drive were powerful, but they were only the beginning. The real battle would be in the days and weeks to come, as the truth came to light and the system faced its reckoning. And then, as the cheers continued to echo, Michael's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and froze. It was a message, an anonymous tip. Asterisk. "Be careful whom you trust. This goes higher than you think." Asterisk. Michael's heart sank, the weight of the warning pressing down on him. He looked out at the crowd, at Amani, at Jerome, and at Daniels, who stood off to the side, his expression unreadable. The victory they had just claimed felt fragile, like a glass sculpture balanced on the edge of a cliff. As the night wore on, Michael knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The warning on Michael's phone weighed heavily on his mind as he made his way home that night. The flash drive and the envelope felt like anchors in his hands, heavy with the responsibility of what they held. The crowd had dispersed, the chants quieting as people returned to their homes, but Michael knew the real work was just beginning. He glanced at Amani, who sat silently in the passenger seat of their car, her face illuminated by the passing streetlights. "You okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I think so," she said quietly. "It's just a lot." Michael reached over, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "I know, but you were brave tonight. I'm so proud of you." Amani managed a small smile, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the day's events. She had seen her father stand up against impossible odds, speaking truth to power, and she had seen the officer who hurt her show a flicker of humanity. It was confusing, overwhelming even, but it gave her a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. When they got home, Jerome was already there, pacing the living room with his phone pressed to his ear. He hung up as soon as they walked in, his expression a mix of relief and urgency. "Man, I've been trying to reach you," he said. "That tip you got, it's no joke. People are already trying to spin this against you. Some outlets are saying you fabricated the evidence." Michael sighed, setting the flash drive and envelope on the coffee table. "Of course they are. They're scared. This kind of truth doesn't come out without a fight." Jerome nodded, sitting down heavily on a couch. "So, what's the plan?" "You can't do this alone." Michael sank into the chair opposite him, his mind racing. "We don't keep this quiet, that's for sure. We go public, get this in front of as many eyes as possible. Once the truth is out, they can't bury it." The next few days were a blur of interviews, meetings, and late nights. Michael partnered with trusted journalists and activists, ensuring the evidence reached the right people. News outlets began publishing detailed reports based on the documents and flash drive, exposing years of corruption within the police department. The story exploded, dominating headlines and sparking debates across the country. Protests grew larger, but they remained peaceful, guided by Michael's insistence on keeping the movement focused on justice, not revenge. Amani watched from the sidelines, her father's resolve inspiring her to find her own voice. She began speaking at community events, sharing her story and connecting with others who had experienced similar pain. Meanwhile, Officer Daniels found himself at the center of a storm. His decision to come forward earned him both praise and backlash. He was ostracized by many of his colleagues, but he found unexpected support in the community he had once hurt. Daniels started attending town hall meetings and listening to the stories of those he had sworn to protect, slowly rebuilding trust, one conversation at a time. As the weeks turned into months, the pressure mounted on the police department. Several high-ranking officials resigned, and an independent investigation was launched. Policies began to change, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like progress was being made. But the fight was far from over, and Michael knew it. One evening, as the family sat together in their small living room, Amani looked up from her homework. "Dad," she asked hesitantly. "Yeah, baby," Michael replied, glancing over at her. "Do you think this will actually change things? Like for real?" Michael paused, considering her question. "I think it already has," he said. "But real change takes time. It's not just about one protest or one story. It's about what we do next, and the next thing after that. It's about all of us deciding we're not going to let things stay the same." Amani nodded, her father's words sinking in. She thought about everything they had been through, the pain and the fear, but also the strength and the hope. It wasn't the ending she had imagined, but it felt like the beginning of something new. The final twist came a few weeks later. Michael received an unexpected phone call from an anonymous number. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "Mr. Reed, we've been watching your work. You're making waves, and some very powerful people aren't happy about it." Michael's stomach tightened. "Who is this?" he demanded. "That's not important," the voice replied. "What's important is that you keep looking over your shoulder. You've exposed part of the truth, but there's more, much more. Be careful who you trust." The line went dead before Michael could respond. He sat there, the phone still pressed to his ear, the warning echoing in his mind. It was a reminder that the fight for justice was never simple or safe. But as he looked at Amani, who was laughing with Joram over some joke he didn't catch, he knew he couldn't stop now. The story wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like they were writing their own ending. Michael's fight had become a movement, and Amani's bravery had sparked something bigger than either of them could have imagined. They didn't know what the future would hold, but they knew they would face it together, one step at a time. As the family settled into the quiet of the evening, Michael sat back and reflected on how far they had come. The journey had been painful, exhausting, and at times terrifying. But it had also been full of moments that reminded him of the strength in community, the power of truth, and the hope for a better tomorrow. He wasn't naive enough to think the road ahead would be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he believed it was worth traveling.